Before we continue with the show, a quick word from today's episode partner, UBS. Do you want to grow with your business? Then the UBS Growth Talks may be for you. You will get support from peers and experts in order to take that next big step towards success. And the best thing, it's free of charge. For more information, go to ubs.com/growth-talks.
Selling a company means starting very, very early, preparing, talking to people, to the right people, to colleagues, entrepreneurs who sold their company already, or to advisors.
Welcome to the Swisspreneur Show, a podcast about startup stories and learnings from experienced entrepreneurs. Here's your host, Sylvan.
Thomas, Vito, a very well welcome to the Swisspreneur Show. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Glad to be here.
Thank you for the invitation.
Vito, you are the head of SME M&A at UBS. So you basically represent the seller side that we're going to talk about today. And you, Thomas, you're the head of Transaction Advisory Switzerland here at UBS. And you basically represent the buyer side that we're going to also address today. My first question is for you, Vito. What are the biggest mistakes that you see of sellers?
Oh, well, there are several mistakes can happen. I think the most important ones are assuming that it will be easy to sell a company. It often is not that easy as someone might expect. Another big mistake that I encounter pretty often is that companies are not well prepared to be sold, and sometimes they are also not documented well enough, to start in such a process.
So yeah, selling a company is not a walk in the park. We're going to address those specific points that you just mentioned in a minute. Of course, we also want to ask you, Thomas, what are the biggest mistakes that you see on the buyer side?
Yeah, it's a question not easy to answer, because actually, as Vito just said, a lot can go wrong with acquisitions since this is a process with quite some complexity that needs a proper planning in terms of timing and parties to be involved. Perhaps I would say probably the biggest mistake is that some buyers do just not understand or do underestimate this fact. And so there are several aspects which have to be considered, and sometimes buyers do just focus on topics where they have their core competence and forget about other things, or do not seek enough advice. For example, in respect of rather unsexy but financially important legal and tax topics.
Yeah, also very important topics that we're also going to address in more detail in a minute. Let's talk about the start of the process, Vito. When is the right time to actually sell my company?
It's not that an easy question, but I think in general you can say that it's best to sell or to sell your company, or to try to sell your company when you see a promising future in front of you. Everybody prefers to buy a company who has a great future in front of it than the opposite. I think also you should have a look at favorable market trends. There can be some changes in politics or stuff like that, or new technologies that come up and are substituting existing ones. Mm-hmm. And to pick up again something I told you before. Start to sell your company when you finish preparing it for this step.
Right. And then basically you also wonder, what are the most common reasons why somebody actually wants to sell a company? Is there a common trend or a common motivation behind that you realize, that you see?
Yeah, that there are many motivations to sell a company. The most ones we encounter is because of succession topics, being the owners are getting in a age range where they realize that they won't do that for the next 20 years. So they have to think about who will be here after me. And this is one of the most common motivations. But also a quite frequent motivation is when you were pretty successful with developing your company until a stage, and then you need to take the next big step. You need a strong partner, which has maybe some capital strength also, which you don't have by your own, and that might be also a motivation to looking for someone who is backing you up. Yeah,
great. And Thomas, on the other side, what different types do you support from the buyer side?
So basically, we support all types of buyers. So these are, for example, competitors, so-called strategic buyers, financial investors like private equity funds, or individuals or family members, as well as management teams in the context of a management buyout or a management buy-in. So buyers can actually come from internal or external, and the latter are often coming into the game in the context of a structured selling or auction process, which is handled by an M&A advisor like Vito is.
Perfect. And that's actually a great segue to the question you mentioned before. Not being ready is a common mistake that you see, and also not preparing the documents accordingly. So what homework, what KPIs also should a company have reached before actually start the selling process?
Yeah, I mean, this, we could talk about this question for about an hour alone, but maybe we can focus on the most important things. I think that it's very important for an entrepreneur or an owner of a company to prepare himself also a little bit for that, what is coming. I mean, that can be done by talking to other entrepreneurs who already sold and went to this process. Just because having or getting information from people you trust, because they're your friends or business partners or whatever, is another way of getting information than from a fiduciary or advisor, whatever. I think it's pretty good if an entrepreneur or an owner of a company which is thinking about starting the process of selling or preparing his company to sell in a few years, if he starts to talk to these guys just to get to know their experiences, or maybe visit some seminars or events. I mean, advisors, also banks, do lots of events in this space. And I mean, each information you can get from this kind of events, it's an information for free. And this will prepare him a little bit, to get an expectation, a real expectation, what's coming. And, all the structural things, being well documented with the company, look that it's saleable. I mean, that, not everything hangs on the owner himself. These are more technical issues. So, I mean, he will encounter that anyway when he starts talking with people and attend such events.
And, today's conversation is also with a specific focus on specific companies. So what we're about to discuss and already mentioned, from your experience, from your perspective, to what companies does that knowledge and experience share actually apply to?
Well, I mean, our clients are basically, most of them are long-standing companies which have, several years of track record, market-proven services or products, and they are, let's say, major companies. I mean, I don't want to tell you that it's impossible to sell young company or startups or whatever, but it's a kind of niche, within M&A itself, and it's another topic. Maybe we can spend another hour to talk about these guys.
Is there a certain revenue threshold that you look at where you say below that specific revenue number, it's probably not a good fit?
Look, instead of revenue, I would prefer to talk about profitability. You know, I mean, to get the attention of professional investors or buyers, either on the strategic side or on the financial buyer side, I mean, you need to be honest, to have to be quite big already. Okay, I don't know if you need a number. Let's say you have to generate around about 2.5 million of EBITDA plus.
Yeah.
And, you know, if your company is a smaller one, you know, like there are several in Switzerland also, then it might be that, the buyer's universe moves a little bit to other private people maybe, which want to become entrepreneurs or owners of a company. Just a little bit another segment of buyers. Let's put it that way.
Right. But I think that gives people a good perspective, you know, about the scope and the focus that we're talking about today. So thank you for sharing that. Then something, no matter whether you're selling or buying a company, something where always the buyers and the sellers meet is basically the due diligence process. So now with a focus on the buyer side, which parties do have to be involved in the due diligence process and how do you coordinate them?
I mean, of course, this depends on the complexity of the transaction itself and specific topics to be covered in the due diligence process. But I would say usually you have at least a financial and tax advisor. This can be the fiduciary or can also be one of the big four for larger transactions. And I would say it's also advisable to have a lawyer on board, particularly for the preparation and negotiation of the purchase agreement and or the documents needed for the closing process. And sometimes don't forget about the tax authorities. They also have to be involved in order to receive a ruling about structural topics, which shall avoid an unpleasant surprise in terms of a tax bill after closing of the transaction. So, I mean, it's really important that the buyer gets an overview of all potential critical topics at the beginning of the process in order to define the scope of the required persons and advisors to be involved in a timely manner.
I think that's something really astonishing that we have here in Switzerland. You can just go to the tax authorities before you actually do the deal and sort of get the ruling in place. And I think that's unique. So you really have to make use of that to do a good job there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, you also heavily focus on the MBI part, the management buy-in process to then actually become part of the company, become an owner. So what role does the bank play in that process?
I mean, obvious one is that the bank provides the acquisition financing for the funding at the end, but I would say actually we also support the buyer in terms of structuring and closing over the whole process, means that we are acting as a kind of a sparring partner for them.
Yeah. And what are the due diligence topics that are important from a bank's perspective, especially also for a potential credit assessment?
Yeah, I mean, the main topic are certainly the intended transaction structure. So simply speaking, who is buying who, just to have a clear picture about that. Then, of course, the sources and uses of the funds, just to see if there is enough equity besides the debt amount that is requested. Then a proper understanding of the rationale and motivation of the seller as well as of the buyer. And of course, we also need some good knowledge about the capabilities and the fit of the buyer, because here we want to avoid any potential transfer risk. And that's particularly in cases of incoming buyers, so in case of a management buy-in, for example. And then very important is, of course, all the financial information, including historical reports, as well as a business plan with projections showing details to main drivers and potential synergies. Yeah. And I mean, it's also key that we get a proper understanding of the business model, the involved technology, of course, the markets, competitors, the value chain. So who are the suppliers? Who are the customers? Are there any dependencies or concentration risks on their side? So, I mean, in general, you can say that the banks and the buyers' information requirements will basically be in the same way. And so transparency does increase the success of the financing as well as the the transaction itself.
Have you ever experienced any red flags from your side in the buying process where you say that was a real showstopper and stopped the whole process?
I mean, of course, as I just mentioned, all the due diligence topics, it's very important that we get involved as soon as possible, so that also the buyer gets early feedback from the bank, that he can also, let's say, bring that into the transaction. Showstopper, for example, as I said, the transfer risk, especially with a management buy-in. I mean, that's very important that we get really a good idea about the buyer itself, about his rationale, his strategy, his background. I mean, that could be a showstopper, besides all the other things that are more common, like the financials, of course.
Yeah. So now we heard what is required from the buyer side, Vito. What else do you think is important from the selling side to consider in that due diligence process?
To be well positioned as a seller for a due diligence, I think the key is to be well prepared. I mean, let people help you to prepare the information which is in 80% of all cases needed, for the due diligence during such a process, no matter who is on the other side of the table, and it is also very useful if you don't prepare the stuff, the documentation just the day before you want to start with due diligence, because firstly it's a massive amount of documentation. I mean, please do not underestimate that and the time it takes you to collect all the information. But not just because of that, also because take the preparation of due diligence also as an opportunity to talk to your advisors on your side, because you will have more or less the same advisors on your side like the buyers have, namely the fiduciary, the tax advisor or tax attorney, or the attorney anyway, the transaction attorney, lawyer, and it's a good chance to go over the documentation and see if there are really big issues which should be solved before you start the due diligence process itself. I mean, buying a share, it's more complicated than someone might think. And I also had clients which, from a juridical point of view, were not the owner of the share they wanted to sell. And stuff like this can be a real mess. When it pops up only in the due diligence process when the buyer's already involved. So that's a good example why you should take this opportunity when you prepare the due diligence documentation, also to see if there is some serious issue which you have to solve before. Yeah. I think this is good advice. Yeah, to start early and involve early the people needed to make sure that everything is okay.
In terms of due diligence preparation, I know there's no solution that fits all, but is there a rough time frame that you would recommend get started at least 3 months before you want to actually have the due diligence and send out the first documents, or what would you recommend there in terms of timeline?
A big chunk of due diligence preparation is collecting the information, the documentation, and nowadays when we are talking about digitalization and stuff like that, I think you could even start 5 years before, because, taking 1 hour each Friday just before you go to the weekend and collect some documents and scan them or and store them and on the right place in a well structure with a good name, and this every week for 1 hour, it's a complete other story than having to pull everything together within 3 months, 2 months, or whatever. I mean, just start as early as you can, because it will help you anyway if you have everything well structured and in electronic form. So,
yeah, that's a fantastic tip, to do that on a regular basis and not waiting until that topic becomes
and
more concrete.
If you manage as an owner to to sell it good to your employees, you can even engage them. I mean,
Right.
You can engage them and say, look, we want to do a digitalization project. Let's have each Friday from 3 to 5 we do this work, and then we get an aperitif together or whatever. You will have the work done without remarking it. Actually,
I like that a lot. That's a creative way of doing it.
Yeah, maybe.
Now, the next phase is the negotiation phase. So you also have in that phase the very important question, how do we find the right price? How do you get there? That's like a very tricky topic, I could imagine.
Yeah, I mean, finding the right price, I mean, it's always crucial in each transaction. However, it's not the only criteria, which basically leads the owner to sell to a specific seller. I mean, you should have valuable idea of what a realistic price should be or could be. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're talking about fundamentally evaluate your company. Then you have the other side, which is basically market dynamics. I mean, if a company is very attractive and you have a lot of buyers who want to buy the company, no matter what it costs, then you sometimes have pretty interesting happenings, at the very end of the negotiation phases, because people start to think, hey, I put it. So much effort in having a look at this company and this transaction. I don't want to lose it now. Mm-hmm. That's a moment where prices are paid which are not really explainable by logics or calculations or whatever. However, when the company is not that attractive and nobody wants it, it's you can calculate on your Excel sheet whatever you want. It's not going to be paid. So there are different elements, the corporate finance valuation elements, which are, basically correct and right. But I mean, market can be cruel sometimes, mm-hmm. And has always a surprise for you.
I think that's a great takeaway, to not underestimate the timing, because all the market dynamics do have an important influence on your price.
Exactly.
A different perspective, Thomas, is basically, can we actually get that price financed? Because that's where you come from the buyer side. What role does that play?
Yeah, I mean, actually, that's a very important question, which is to be answered as soon as possible, and better before the signing of the purchase agreement, of course. So, I mean, the debt amount which a bank offers provides the buyer also with a benchmark for the purchase price, and therefore also for the negotiation. So means if the gap that has to be filled with equity or a vendor loan is high, then the price obviously also seems to be rather high, right? And you're going to pay a decent part of the price for the projected upside. Mm-hmm. And I mean, the debt financing itself, it's more based on the available free cash flows. So it's more a historical consideration, taking into account of a part of the upside. But it's probably more conservative compared to a pure equity valuation.
In that regard, just maybe a random question from my personal curiosity. How do you structure that? Do you usually work with companies that buy other companies, or do you work with private person who are then also personally reliable if the debt cannot be paid back?
I mean, in terms of structure, what we usually have are Swiss corporates instead of private persons or individuals. That's also due to the tax advantages that you have, and more flexibility if you think about any potential disposal in the future.
Yeah, great. And you mentioned negotiations. So Vito, I wonder from the seller perspective, if you have any negotiation tips that you can give to our listeners.
A very basic one is to go pretty open-minded in these kind of discussions. I mean, when you are already sitting at the negotiation table, that means basically that you did a lot of right. I mean, that means that basically both of you want to have a deal together. Okay, that's a good premise in order to be successful. Then, people who are talking to you as a seller. I mean, you are selling your company, and people who are talking to you, they don't know the company as good as you have, as you do, and you have to keep that every time in mind. And even when the questions come or some clauses are negotiated which you really don't like, it's not because the buyer wants to hurt you, it's because maybe it didn't understand something right. And so you should take the negotiation table as an opportunity also, again, like the due diligence, to clarify stuff, open questions, in order to get the most attractive terms in the contract which do not hurt you. Stay cool, try not to get angry, even if sometimes it's really difficult, and don't talk too much.
I also once heard, so I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about that whoever wants the deal less actually wins the negotiation, because you could basically walk away at any moment. Is that true from your experience?
Yeah, it might be a little bit true, but when you end up at the negotiation table, then basically both parts did a lot of work already. Yeah. And you have to keep in mind that once you are there, nobody wants to walk away, actually, because they want to do the deal.
Yeah, you're already emotionally attached to the thought of making a deal together.
But it can happen, for sure. I mean, but it's not the intent a priori for both parties.
And of course, the question that you also ask yourself, probably somewhere along the process, ideally at the beginning, should I get external help to walk through that process with me?
Well, look, I think that's a really good advice to get people on board, advisors for the different topics. As we said before, tax, legal, process management, in order to help you, because people do not even buy a television alone or sell a television alone. So why should be selling a company more easier than that? I mean, if there is something where you need partners who help you out and which know the process, because it's a process you usually do not more than once in a lifetime. I think you should take the chance to get them on board. Yeah.
And from your perspective and experience, Thomas, any other part where you should really get help, or anything to add to that question?
No, actually, I would just confirm what Vito just mentioned. I mean, don't try to save money with advisors, especially not with legal or tax advisors. And definitely make sure that you get the bank on board before you agree on the purchase agreement.
In that regard, is it also helpful, or would you recommend to also have, despite, of course, the money that you pay for the advisors, to also have sort of a success rate where you get a percentage of the buying or purchase price?
Well, that's basically more common in sell-side situations where you during the whole process you get little payments, actually, and a big chunk of your payments or your payoff is linked to the successful sale of the company.
Got it.
That's pretty common, yeah.
So, Thomas, you already talked about the important role of the bank in the due diligence process, and of course, that serves the actual financing aspect. So, what is the UBS's offering for transaction financing?
I mean, it's quite a lot where we can support, of course. So, UBS provides tailor-made financing solutions for all kind of buyers, as I've mentioned, and situations. So, for successions in terms of an MBO or MBI, corporate acquisitions with strategic buyers, or the leveraged buyouts with more financial investors. And in this context, we are acting as a sparring partner to the buyer over the whole process in several aspects. For example, this also includes a second opinion on these very important aspects for legal and tax topics by our internal experts. In addition, we coordinate the whole closing and funding process and therefore support our clients to ensure utmost transaction security. And last but not least, not to forget all the other aspects in connection with the transaction and the operating business. So UBS, as a global universal bank, can of course offer all the things like the account openings, payment services, FX, trade finance, and a lot more.
That's a very well-rounded package. And in that regard, you also probably get the question, what are some common financing parameters that you pay attention to?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps starting with the most important one is the financing amount, which is defined on the basis of the sustainable free cash flows after tax and capex. And this amount has to be sufficient to repay the acquisition financing within 5 to 7 years. Mm-hmm. In addition, we usually require at least 20% of equity. This shall also ensure the buyer's commitment.
Skin in the game, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah. And further common structural elements that are common for these type of transactions, like that we take the shares of the acquired company as a security, some financial covenants, certain limitations for further indebtedness or repayment of equity. And as we already discussed, so from a structural perspective, we usually have corporations as a buyer and a borrower. And as I said, this is due to the flexibility and some advantages on the tax side.
Yeah. And therefore also you need a certain size to actually be able to pull that off, as you also mentioned.
Yeah.
So Vito, after you sold the company, after the closing, you probably also get faced with the question, hey, I built or led this company. What should my role be after the sale?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, if you manage to have a role after the sales which puts you in absolutely freedom, maybe you can go to a nice island and have a little bit of vacation. However, I mean, it's not always the case. And owners of company, entrepreneurs are very different also in this perspective. I had the possibility to get to know people or owners of companies who sold and wanted to be part of the further development of the company under the new owner. You know, maybe paying more attention to key accounts or strategic projects, and a little bit less on leadership stuff like and administration topics. On the other side, there are situations where the buyer requires you actually to stay for a period of time because this is especially in smaller companies, you know, when the success and the value of the company is very is tightly linked to the entrepreneur himself. That the buyers requires or asks you to stay engaged, and maybe then you talk about earnout, and so these are situations where the seller is not that free to go the day after the closing to the island, but it's pretty different from situation to situation. What happens to you when you sold your company? There is no one way fits it all, but I mean, I think that you should pay attention to if you are not allowed to go straight away, or if you don't want to go straight away, that you at least negotiate terms about when will I be able to go. That you plan, you know, the final cut off. Yeah. Otherwise, you will be waiting for it for the rest of your life, and you don't want that.
You don't want to have the island postponed forever.
Exactly,
yeah.
Exactly.
So that's already a wrap of the process. Thomas, I quickly want to ask you, do you have any final tips or additional resources that you can recommend to people to dig in if they want to know more about the whole process?
I mean, final tip perhaps in the whole process, or especially after closing, don't forget about the stakeholders. So I mean, especially after a change of control or change of ownership, there's quite some uncertainty. And the buyer has to make sure that the key employees or customers and suppliers, that they stay on board to ensure the successful continuation of the business.
Very good recommendation. Yeah, thank you. Vito, any final tips from your side?
Well, I like to stress out again that selling a company means starting very, very early, preparing, talking to people, to the right people, to colleagues, entrepreneurs who sold their company already, or to advisors, trying to find out as much as possible in order to shape your expectation and your view, on that, what is coming, what expects you. And I think this is the most important advice you can give to an owner who is thinking about selling his company sometimes.
Right. Perfect. So to wrap up today's episode, we have some rapid fire questions for you. Thomas, I want to start with you right away. What is the best reason to buy from your perspective?
Well, I would say besides growth and synergies, perhaps just becoming an entrepreneur and living your dream.
Nice. And Vito, what is the best reason to sell?
I think the best reason to sell is just to preserve the workplaces you created.
Oh, also a good one. And what is your favorite sentence during a negotiation?
I think we are not too far away from each other.
And then the last one for you, Thomas, buying or selling a company, if you had to choose one?
Tricky question. Whatever. I mean, just make sure that you have proper process planning and all the required parties involved early enough. It's important, including the financing bank, of course.
Yeah. And for you, Vito, buying or selling?
I think owning one, which is running greatly.
That's actually also a very good option. Yeah, I would probably also choose that one. Vito, Thomas, thank you so much for being here. Lots of success and all the best with hopefully many more companies to buy and to sell in your areas.
Thank you, Silvan, for having us here.
It was a pleasure.